Welcome to this explainer. Today we are going to trace what was a truly dramatic, rapid, and honestly sometimes shocking transformation of the American factory. We're looking at a super tight window here, just from 1900 to 1914. But in that short time, we're taking a journey from an era of totally unregulated, incredibly dangerous sweatshops, right into a system of hyper-efficient, highly paid mechanization. It's essentially the origin story of the modern workplace, and it completely redefined what it actually means to be an employee.
To really set the stage, listen to this powerful testimony from a Ford worker in the 1920s. This establishes exactly where our story is heading today. By the end of the era we're discussing, the rhythm of human labor wasn't dictated by the sun anymore, or even by a craftsman's own intuition. It was entirely controlled by the relentless, unyielding pace of the machine. The machine literally became the boss. But to truly understand how workers ended up surrendering so much autonomy to a machine, we first have to understand what they were desperately trying to escape.
So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the unregulated factory, the tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the rise of scientific management, Henry Ford's moving assembly line, and finally, the infamous $5 day. Let's dive in.
All right, Section 1, the unregulated factory, or basically life before labor laws. We need to take a hard look at the grim reality of industrial work right at the dawn of the 20th century.
Before safety standards, before minimum wages, the factory floor was an absolutely brutal place. To put this into perspective, just imagine the baseline conditions for a second. We're talking 13-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with maybe a 30-minute lunch break if you were lucky. And for all of that exhausting labor, you take home a paltry $6. This was the everyday reality for thousands of workers, mostly young, Eastern European Jewish and Italian immigrant women in the New York City garment industry. They were toiling endlessly in these crowded, unsanitary shops just to survive. They often had to supply their own needles and thread. And get this, they were actually fined if they were a few minutes late.
But hey, the workers didn't just take this lying down. They fought back. In November 1909, a 23-year-old garment worker named Clara Lemlich stood up at a mass meeting. Now, she had already been beaten by hired thugs on the picket line, but she still boldly called for a general strike. This single moment sparked the uprising of the 20,000, where thousands of young women simply walked out of the factories. By 1910, they actually managed to secure a protocol of peace that improved wages and hours. But, and this is a tragic but, factory owners vehemently refused to address key safety demands. Things like unlocking exit doors or fixing condemned fire escapes were just completely ignored.
And that stubborn refusal by management brings us to Section 2, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a devastating catalyst for change.
146. That is the solemn, heartbreaking death toll of the workers who perished on March 25, 1911. A fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Ash Building in New York. Because management had literally locked the exit doors, mainly to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing scraps of fabric, the young women on the 9th floor were completely trapped. The building's one single fire escape collapsed right under their weight, and the fire department's ladders, they only reached the 7th floor. With absolutely no other way out, dozens of workers were forced to jump from the windows to the street below.
The sheer horror of this fire jolted the public conscience like nothing else. Over 350,000 people marched in a massive funeral procession. The public outrage was so intense that it forced the creation of the New York Factory Investigating Commission. And this wasn't just some token committee designed to make people feel better. It was a massive statewide effort. They investigated over 3,300 workplaces. Driven by tireless reformers like Francis Perkins, this commission resulted in a huge wave of progressive safety and health laws. We're talking mandatory fire escapes, proper ventilation, and actual machine guarding. It fundamentally shifted the entire cultural mindset from, well, accidents happen, to the radical idea that the government actually has a duty to protect the health of the working person.
Now, while the government was slowly forcing improvements in physical safety, management was busy cooking up a completely new way to tightly control labor. So Section 3, the rise of scientific management and the pursuit of absolute efficiency. Entered this man, Frederick Taylor. He was an efficiency expert who looked at the standard factory floor and saw nothing but chaos. He wanted to entirely replace traditional rule-of-thumb working methods. You know, the old way where a worker actually used their own judgment and skill to get a job done. Taylor wanted to replace all of that with exact, calculated science.
The philosophical shift here was stark. Under the old system, success depended almost entirely on getting the initiative of the workmen. Management gave you a job and, well, you figured out how to do it best. But under Taylor's scientific management, it's a total 180. The brain work is entirely removed from the shop floor.
Management plans every single movement in advance. They tell you exactly what to do, exactly how to do it, and the exact fraction of a minute you have to complete it. To prove his theory actually worked, Taylor ran a really famous experiment at the Bethlehem Steel Company. He focused on a Pennsylvania worker named Henry Knoll, who Taylor just referred to in his writings as Schmidt. Taylor offered Schmidt $1.85 a day, which, to be fair, was a pretty nice bump from his usual $1.15, but it came with one massive condition. Schmidt had to strictly, unquestionably follow management's physical commands. When they said walk, he walked. When they said rest, he rested. Absolutely no thinking aloud, just doing.
And the results? They were staggering. By rigidly controlling Schmidt's walking speed, his carrying angle, and precisely calculating his rest intervals down to the second, Taylor increased the amount of pig iron Schmidt handled in a single day from an average of 12.5 tons to an astonishing 47.5 tons. He nearly quadrupled a single man's output simply by treating him like a machine that just needed calibrating. It's almost unbelievable when you think about it.
So, this experiment crystallized into Taylor's 4 core principles. He published these specific steps. First, you scientifically figure out the best way to do a task. Second, you select the exact right physical specimen for the job. Third, you force them to follow the science. And fourth, management takes over all the planning. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. Taylorism fundamentally removed mental autonomy from the worker and handed it entirely to the managers. The worker's only real job was absolute obedience.
Of course, this total obsession with measuring every single movement soon found its ultimate mechanical expression. That brings us to Section 4, the moving assembly line, Henry Ford's major innovation.
By late 1913, Henry Ford had fully implemented the moving assembly line. He essentially took the principles of scientific management and baked them directly into the factory architecture. Instead of workers moving around a car to build it, the car moved past the workers. It took what was once considered skilled craft work and reduced it to simple, rote, endlessly repetitive tasks. And sure enough, the efficiency gains were mind-blowing. They dropped production times for a single Model T from 12.5 hours down to just 93 minutes. But those explosive production gains came at a massive human cost. Imagine standing in one exact spot, doing the exact same repetitive motion over and over all day long, completely dictated by the speed of a conveyor belt. It's no surprise that this soul-crushing monotony drove workers to quit in droves. In fact, Ford experienced a crippling labor turnover rate of 370%. To put that into perspective, it meant that to keep a steady workforce of roughly 14,000 guys, Ford had to hire over 52,000 people in a single year. The line was incredibly efficient, sure, but it was actively breaking the human being standing next to it.
Desperate to keep his assembly line staffed, Ford needed a radical solution, which leads us to our final chapter, Section 5, the $5 day, buying loyalty and creating consumers.
On January 5, 1914, Ford absolutely stunned the industrial world. He announced out of nowhere that he was more than doubling the standard wage and cutting the workday by an hour. The news generated these glowing headlines globally. The reaction was so wild that thousands of men literally rioted at his factory gates in the freezing, icy January weather, just trying to get a job. Ford actually had to turn them away with fire hoses.
However, what totally got lost in all those glowing headlines was the catch. To earn that full $5, workers had to submit to Ford's Sociological Department. This wasn't just a flat raise, no. It was a profit-sharing bonus based entirely on your private life. Ford actually sent inspectors into workers' homes to ensure they were living up to his moral standards. Seriously, imagine your boss inspecting your living room. You had to abstain from alcohol, keep your home absolutely spotless, not take in any boarders, and regularly save money. If you failed the inspection, you didn't get the bonus. You had already traded away your bodily autonomy on the factory floor, and now you were forced to trade away your privacy at home.
Ultimately, by raising wages so drastically, Ford accomplished two major things. First, he obviously solved his turnover problem. Workers finally stayed on the assembly line. But second, and much more importantly for history, he essentially created a new middle class. He created workers who, for the very first time, were earning enough money to actually purchase the very Model Ts they were building. This idea single-handedly laid the foundation for the modern consumer economy we all live in today. So, as we wrap up this explainer, looking back at this wild journey from the deadly fires of unregulated sweatshops to the high-paying yet soul-crushing efficiency of the assembly line, we have to ask ourselves a pretty heavy question. Was the trade-off of personal autonomy for unprecedented prosperity actually worth the cost? And looking at your own job today, how much of Frederick Taylor and Henry Ford's legacy is still dictating the way you work? Think about that, and keep learning.